If I were asked what are Freud's three most important contributions, I would say 1, human contradictoriness, number 2, disguise and defense, and number 3, the Oedipus complex. So let me take these in order, starting with human contradictoriness. I think a basic Freudian discovery, although he was not the first, obviously, to see this about human nature, is that we are profoundly divided selves. Of course, this had been seen by philosophers and playwrights before him. Certainly, we could say that Freud really affirms that we are both always Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. There is the conscious self and the unconscious self. There is the manifest self and the latent self. There is the part of the self that does the repressing, and then there is the part of the self that is repressed. We are profoundly ambivalent creatures. Wherever we love, we also hate, says Freud. He says no relationship, human relationship, reaches any depth without both hate and love being present. Wherever we hate, we often also love. Of course, Melanie Klein agrees. She describes the contradiction as that between the paranoid schizoid position and the depressive position. These are not stages for Klein, these are layers of the mind. In the paranoid schizoid position, magical thinking prevails, splitting prevails, everything is all good or all bad, whereas in the depressive or the reparative position, we enter a triangular space, a three-dimensional instead of a two-dimensional world, where love and hate, instead of being split off from one another, are able to exist side by side. That is, we are able to feel both the love and the hate towards the same object without splitting the object, resulting in one all good and one all bad, one intensely loved, one intensely hated. The same vis-a-vis the self. In the depressive position, we are able to see both our devalued bad self together with our good self, and we're able to see both sides now. These, again, are not stages, they're layers of the mind. We oscillate between them, but it would be fair to say that a part of the self is always operating in PS, while another part of the self is operating in the depressive or reparative position. So here again is human contradictoriness. Some time ago I did a video lecture on God, and the question was, do I or do I not believe in God? Well, I both believe in God and I do not believe in God. When I'm operating in my most rational, depressive, reparative position, I do not believe in God. I do not believe in magic. I do not believe in the supernatural. But there's a part of me in the paranoid schizoid position which continues to believe in magical thinking, and therefore probably does continue to believe in a supernatural God and other forms of superstition. I try my best to inhabit the depressive, rational, reparative position, but I can't deny the fundamental fact that Freud discovers, or if not discover, at least elaborates, which is that we are contradictory. I am in contradiction with myself. I both believe and I disbelieve. I think the strength of the Greek and Russian Orthodox positions in Christianity is that it seems to accept that there can be no faith without doubt. And, well, the phrase, Lord, I believe, help thou mine disbelief, seems to do justice to the recognition that we are always in contradiction in this way. So we are creatures of conflict and contradiction. We try to work out what Freud called compromise formations between these different poles of the self. Compromises or blends or alloys. I've always liked the concept of the compound. As in chemistry, we break compounds down into their component elements. In psychoanalysis, we try to understand psychic structures, symptoms, character traits as compounds composed of a blend of competing and often opposing forces, compounds of both love and hate, the wish to be dirty and the wish to be clean, leading to a compromise formation, such as in the artist who finds a clean way of being dirty or a dirty way of being clean. He produces a dialectical synthesis between these opposing wishes. So this is Freud's model of character formation and symptom formation, compounds or alloys of opposing elements of a self perennially in conflict. Different people inhabit the conflict in different ways. On the level of the paranoid schizoid position, the conflict is lived by splitting off the love and the hate in a world where everything is either all light or all dark. In the depressive position, we find ways of trying to work out blends or compounds. This is a dialectical move, such that the conflicting elements are both negated and yet preserved and raised to a higher level, the Hegelian synthesis, which somehow represents a considerable degree of integration of the opposing forces, whereas in the paranoid schizoid position we have a large degree of disintegration or unintegration of the opposing forces. Okay, human contradictoriness then. Everyone is both Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, but we strive to be Dr. Jekyll, we strive to present ourselves on the level of the depressive or the reparative position as civilized people, but this means that somehow we have to get rid of, suppress, repress Mr. Hyde, or somehow manage to integrate him creatively into a self that somehow dialectically transcends and yet integrates these opposing forces. Okay, having to live with these contradictions, we often need to or feel the need to suppress or repress the unacceptable part of the self. If one wants to be a totally bad person, one has to get rid of one's goodness. If one wants to be a good person, one has to get rid of one's badness. There's a great deal of difference between suppressing one's dark side and repressing it. In suppression, we remain consciously aware of Mr. Hyde, but we suppress him. We subordinate him. We constrain him. We don't pretend he doesn't exist. We may be well aware of his existence, but we deprive him of access to the steering wheel. We have Dr. Jekyll in the driver's seat, and we know that Mr. Hyde is ready to seize the wheel, but we prevent him one way or another from doing so without denying his existence. In repression, we deceive ourselves into somehow forgetting his existence, blinding ourselves to his existence, pretending that somehow we are entirely Dr. Jekyll. There is no contrary self fighting to seize control. And of course, Freud's discovery is the disguised return of the repressed. That which we push out of consciousness is going to find its way back to the surface, but usually in a disguised form. So the repressed Mr. Hyde will show up one way or another, possibly in savage and harsh criticism of the self, perhaps in guilt, perhaps in a sense of fraudulence, perhaps in symptoms of one kind or another. The repressed aggression and savagery will find its way back in a disguised form. So here we have this second main theme in Freud's work, the nature of defense and the nature of disguise. Of course, he elaborates this most clearly in his dream theory, where he discusses the ways that the latent thoughts, the latent wishes that really generate the dream are prevented from overtly expressing themselves in the dream, because this would defeat the purpose of the dream, the purpose of which is to enable us to go on sleeping. If the repressed wishes and thoughts are not thoroughly enough disguised, they will wake up the dreamer, who will wake up in order to prevent the repressed wishes from becoming conscious. So one of the ways that the dream operates is through the mechanism of condensation, which is disguise through replacing one element with another with which it is similar. It is disguise on the basis of similarity. So the patient has a dream all night long. She's in a shoe store trying on one pair of shoes after another, slipping her foot into one, taking it off, trying on another, taking it off. All night long, it's the old in-out. The foot slips into the shoe, the foot comes out of the shoe, the slip foot's into another shoe. The foot, of course, being analogous to the penis, the shoe analogous to the vagina. This is disguise on the basis of similarity. There's a similarity between the foot and the penis, and there's a similarity between the shoe and the vagina. This does not look like a dream about sexual intercourse. Disguise is affected by metaphor. Freud calls this condensation. The second mechanism of disguise is displacement. Here again, we have one thing being substituted for another, but this time not on the basis of some element in common, not on the basis of similarity, but on the basis of contiguity. In the first case, we have similarity or metaphor. In displacement, we have contiguity or metonymy. So all he remembers is that bacon was sizzling on the stove and the house was filling with that wonderful smell of bacon, and his association goes to eggs, and then he remembers that the condom broke and he's wondering if his partner's egg may have gotten fertilized, and it turns out to be a dream about a fear of pregnancy. Bacon has been replaced by eggs, but bacon doesn't resemble eggs. Eggs don't resemble bacon, but they are regularly found together. They are contiguous, and so their contiguity has been the basis of a substitution in the service of disguise. Freud goes on to talk about how dreams operate through plastic representation, a kind of picture language, and then further there can be use of what he thought of as a kind of universal symbolism that he believed arose from a collective unconscious. Everyone thinks that only Jung had a collective unconscious. Freud, too, to a much lesser degree, believed in a collective unconscious that takes the form of this universal language of symbolism. I believe that here Freud makes a great mistake. He departs from his overall method of contextualizing and slips into the fallacy of essentializing in this one area of his dream theory, as if there is such a thing as a universal language of symbols. In his overall contextualizing approach, Freud does not claim to know the meaning of dreams. Psychoanalysts do not know the meaning of dreams. All we have is a method for discovering the meaning, to help the patient, that is, discover the meaning of his or her dreams, precisely by placing the dream in the context of the patient's associations to it and to his or her general life situation, to the extent that he's in an analysis 3 or 4 times a week. The analysis and the analyst become an important part of the patient's life, and therefore part of the context in which the patient is bringing dreams. And so dreams do not always necessarily refer to the analytic situation, but they often do, which is not to deny that they also refer to other parts of the patient's life. So contextualizing, as opposed to essentializing, Freudians tend to see Jungians as quite guilty of this idea that there is a universal symbolism that can be known, and Freud buys into this to a degree, and I think here makes a mistake and opens the door to a kind of analyst authoritarianism, where instead of helping the patient discover the meaning of his or her dream, the analyst steps in as if he knows what things mean. And I feel this is usually an error. A snake in a dream does not always refer to a penis. The snake might turn out to be a boa constrictor that surrounds and smothers you, perhaps like a mother might be experienced as a smothering mother. The snake might eat you alive. I believe that the medical symbol of healing is a snake twirled around a pole or a staff, and that's a representation of healing. So we don't know what things mean, except by placing them in the context of a particular person's associations to them. The final aspect of Freud's idea of the dream work or the disguise work is what he called secondary revision. The latent thoughts have been broken up. They've been condensed. They've been displaced. They've been plastically represented. They've been symbolized. And now these disarranged bits are rearranged, but in a false order, to convey a false meaning. And this throws off the discovery of the real latent thoughts by creating a seemingly plausible meaning to the dream, which ends further investigation and thus serves the censorship. Okay. So without going any further into the dream theory, suffice it to say that psychoanalysis is a theory of disguise, how we need to get beyond the manifest dream, the manifest story, the manifest narrative, by undoing the mechanisms of disguise that Freud called the dream work, which is really the disguise work. We need to reverse this to get back to the latent thoughts and wishes that have generated the dream or the narrative. Proper psychoanalytic work, of course, doesn't just focus on what are recognized as dreams, but see the whole psychoanalytic session as a dream. The analyst tries to be relatively silent for at least the first part of the session so that he can allow the patient's associations to be put into words, the patient's free associations, and then together, analyst and analysand look at the resulting stories, the resulting narrative, as if it were a dream, and they associate, the patient associates to the narrative, and together they try to get behind the manifest content of the session, into the latent thoughts and wishes that have generated it. Latent thoughts, wishes, fears, other emotions that lie beneath the manifest narrative. So this method is applied not just to dreams, but to the analytic session, to literature, to film, and so on. So this is essentially related to the theme of defense mechanisms. Disguise is affected in the same way defense is effected. Condensation is a defense mechanism, as is displacement. Repression is a defense mechanism. Projection, transference. People have come up with lists of defenses. George Vaillant, in one of his books on the defenses, lists 20 or more mechanisms or processes of defense or disguise. My colleague Joseph Fernando, in his book The Analysis of Defense, studies this in some detail. So we are creatures who lie to ourselves. Psychoanalysis is a theory of self-deception, the way we pull the wool over our own eyes and the eyes of others. It's a theory of how we lie and deceive ourselves and others. And of course, in the course of an analysis, we become acquainted with our characteristic methods of self-deception, and therefore can become relatively alert to this. Okay, so the first of our themes is human contradictoriness, and the second concerns how we cope with our contradictions by pretending to a consistency or a unity or an integration that we don't really possess, although people are more or less successful in working out an integrated self, but none of us achieve anything near perfect integration. So how do we cope with the contrary and contradictory bits? Well, we resort to defenses, and we resort to disguise. The third theme that I think is centrally important to Freudian theory is the Oedipus complex. which has often been written about, including by Freud himself, that I think makes it very difficult to grasp the real meaning of this theory. Of course, Freud was very impressed by Sophocles' drama based on the Oedipus myth. King Elias hears the prophecy of the blind seer Tiresias, who predicts that Laius's son will one day slay him and have his wife, his mother. So Laius and Jocasta decide to kill the child. They break his ankles and put him out in the forest to die. A woodcutter comes along and has pity on the child and takes him to a faraway land, where he is adopted by the king and queen of that land. He's raised thinking they are his parents. He gets wind of the prophecy, and in order to protect his parents, he leaves that country and travels to another, and on the way he encounters an arrogant man who tries to drive him off the road. They fight. Oedipus kills that man, not knowing that it's his father. He goes into the city, which is under the curse of the Sphinx. He who can solve the riddle relieves the city of its curse. Oedipus solves the riddle. They make him king. With the throne comes Jocasta, and so now he has killed his father and he has married his mother. When Jocasta begins to find confirmation for her suspicion that she might have married her son, she goes off and hangs herself. Oedipus puts out his eyes. Freud observes people coming out of a performance of the play, ashen-faced, trembling, and he asks, why does this play have such a profound emotional impact on people? The answer being that everyone at one point in childhood was a little Oedipus. And so we have the theory of the Oedipus complex, which for Freud meant that between around 2.5 to 5 years of age, the child, both the boy and the girl, fall in love with the mother. They obviously were already loving mother, but 2.5, 3, they fall in love with all of the characteristic features of falling in love: intense jealousy, rivalry, a desire to monopolize the love. And Freud emphasizes the sexual element in this, which I think is greatly exaggerated. Not that these feelings don't often become sexualized or take a sexual form, but I will argue that they are not fundamentally sexual, and this is a revision of Freud's theory of the Oedipus complex. So Freud sees the little boy falling in love with mother, wanting her all to himself, wanting to steal her from father. He envies father's connection with mother. He hates father for this. He wishes to get rid of father. He fears father will sense his rivalry and his hostility and may punish him severely. His feelings about his mother are associated with his penis, and therefore he fears an attack on his penis by the father. This is castration anxiety. And of course, Freud sees the theme of castration reflected in the blindness of Tiresias, the soothsayer, but also in Oedipus plucking out his eyes when he finds out that he has been committing incest. So we have also the related theory of the castration complex. In the 1970s, feminists seemed not to have read Freud very carefully, because they misinterpreted Freud as saying the little boy falls in love with mother and the little girl falls in love with father. And there's this nice parallelism. Freud was well aware that this was not the case. There is no such parallelism. Both boy and girl fall in love with the mother. And the question of how the little girl goes from her Oedipus complex focused on her mother to switching over, if she does, to taking father as her desired object is something that, a mystery that preoccupied Freud throughout the 1920s. And he wrote a lot about how that switch takes place, while being well aware that for some women it doesn't take place. So I'm not going to try to go any further into those complexities, but instead shift to the question of the universality of the Oedipus complex. Freud claimed that this was a feature of childhood in all times, all places, all periods, all cultures. And of course this was immediately challenged by sociologists, anthropologists, those psychoanalysts influenced by social science, analysts such as Erich Fromm, who really thought that the Oedipus was not universal at all, but a particular complex that has to do with authority and power conflicts in patriarchal cultures, where boys certainly have to deal with this father, this paternal authority. So Fromm sociologically relativizes the Oedipus complex to patriarchal societies. Fromm, like other Marxists, Wilhelm Reich, others, who wanted to sociologize the complex and make it sociologically relative, they pounced on the data produced by the anthropologist Bronislaw Malinowski, who got trapped in the Trobriand Islands. He planned to stay there for a time to study the culture, but the First War broke out and he ended up being there for, I think, almost 10 years. And so he produced this very detailed ethnography of Trobriand culture. And this culture is matrilineal and matrilocal. That is, lineage is traced through the mother, and when one marries, when a man marries, he moves to his wife's village. And he's really rather a nobody in his wife's village, because the person responsible for raising his children is his wife's brother. The maternal brother, the boy's maternal uncle, has real responsibility for looking after his sister and her children. And in this situation, the little boy's Oedipal hostility is not towards the man who sleeps with mother, his father, but rather towards his uncle. Divorce is easily achieved in this culture. A wife simply says, "I divorce you," and the husband is gone. The husband is a nobody in his wife's village, because the big man there is her brother. But the father is a big man back in his own village, because back in his own village he's an uncle, and he is responsible for his sister and her sister's children. So the boy's hostility is not towards the one who sleeps with mother, but towards this person who has authority and responsibility for him. So the Marxists say, you see, Freud was wrong. It's not about sex at all. It's about power. It's about domination. It's about authority. And Fromm concludes, therefore, it is a feature of a patriarchal society where you have authoritarian fathers and so on. Okay, along comes Anne Parsons, daughter of the famous sociologist Talcott Parsons, and she reanalyzes Malinowski's data and finds that Trobriand culture is filled with jokes and taboos and avoidances, all reflecting a preoccupation with the possibility of incest between brother and sister. All kinds of dirty jokes about brothers and sisters getting together. Taboo avoidances. If they're coming down a path in the jungle, one or the other has to get off the path. They're not supposed to be alone together, and so on. What does Parsons essentially conclude? Against the Freudians, she says the Oedipus complex is not fundamentally about sex. But against the Marxists, she says, neither is it fundamentally about authority. What then is it really about? It's about priority. It's about who is most important to whom. The Oedipal desire is not primarily for sex with mother. It's the desire to be the apple of mother's eye, the most important person in her life. I want her to only have eyes for me. And of course, this is impossible. I realized one day that I thought she was looking at me, but she's actually looking over my shoulder at someone else. It could be my father, it could be my brother, it could be my sister, but she's looking at a third, and she's involved with a third. And I'm not the exclusive apple of her eye, and can never be. And this is painful to recognize. This is a move from the dyadic world where I imagine I'm center. This is decentering. I'm not the center of her world. This is a painful recognition, and it generates the emotion of jealousy. And there can be no culture or time when this does not happen, because we're mammals and we're primates and we form attachments to the primary caregiver, who's often the mother. This doesn't have to play out around the actual biological mother. It plays out around the primary caregiver, who could be the father, or it could be a nanny, could be a grandmother. Doesn't really matter. The point is, we want to be the apple of that person's eye, and we inevitably discover that she has eyes for others as well, and this generates jealousy and hostility and rivalry. And since the hostility and rivalry is directed at people that we also love, siblings, father, mother, we have guilt. So we have this complex of longing to be the center, discovering that we are not, jealousy, hostility, guilt, fear of retaliation. This is the Oedipus complex. It is universal. It is not fundamentally, only secondarily, sometimes, about sexuality. It's really, it's a narcissistic project. This is also implicitly recognized by Jacques Lacan, who says that my desire is the desire of the other. That is, my desire is to be desired. It's not fundamentally a sexual issue. It becomes complex in our society because, from the little boy's point of view, the most important person in mother's life is also sleeping with her. And so one can easily make the mistake that the jealousy is fundamentally about sexuality. The Trobriand material indicates that it is not fundamentally a sexual issue, but it's an issue about a narcissistic desire to monopolize the love, the desire, and the look of the other. So this is a universal frustration, a universal process of decentering. Freud could have made narcissism the central problem in his psychology. In places he comes close to doing this, but he slides away from the point and he returns to the idea that the drives of sex on the one hand and aggression on the other are the real root of the problem. When, certainly from a Lacanian point of view and from other modern psychoanalytic perspectives, the real problem is narcissism and this process of decentering and the jealousy and the rivalry and the guilt that inevitably arise from this. Recently, I read an author, Sergio Benvenuto, who in passing makes an interesting criticism of Melanie Klein, who thought that this jealousy was rooted in a fear of object loss. The reason I get jealous when my partner is showing interest in someone else is because I'm afraid she will leave me. Benvenuto says, no, that's not it at all. It would not be at all reassuring to Othello to be told that, look, relax, Desdemona is never going to leave you. She just likes sleeping with Cassius from time to time. That's hardly reassuring. Oedipal jealousy is not fundamentally about object loss. It's about the insult to narcissism of the fact that my partner desires someone else. This cannot be reduced to the fear of object loss. There's no way there's no solution to the Oedipal dilemma. If you're an Oedipal winner, you're a loser. If you're an Oedipal loser, you're a loser. What do I mean? Say you succeed in many ways. From the boy's point of view, in defeating the father. Mother castrates the father. He sleeps on a cot down in the basement. She takes her boy into her bed. He understands that fundamentally her desire is focused on him. He has won the competition with his father, and this is a nightmare because while on the one hand he triumphs, on the other he's full of guilt and a need for self-punishment for defeating his father in this way. So although on one level it looks like he wins, on a deeper level he certainly loses. And then of course there's the situation where the boy clearly loses. Mother loves father. She may also love him, but she loves father and grants father access that she doesn't grant to her son. Father has these special privileges that the son does not have. So he loses. And now he feels like a loser on some level. How does he cope with that? So there's no way of navigating this without being wounded one way or another. We are all, for the rest of our lives, coping more or less well or poorly with our woundedness that comes out of this triangular situation where two's company and three's a crowd, and how do we deal with this triangle? Of course, this is the stuff of literature and film and soap operas, the eternal triangle. Some people cope with the pain of jealousy by erotizing it, switching it from pain into pleasure. In certain perverse ways. Other people cope with it by inflicting the pain on others, by putting the third person in the position of the loser, perhaps by cuckolding them, stealing their wives or girlfriends, and making the other man suffer the jealousy. There are all kinds of different ways, many rather perverse, for trying to cope with Oedipal pain and the castration complex as well. And this is the stuff of psychoanalysis. I think Freud was clearly incorrect in his dating of the Oedipus complex. He saw it as emerging somewhere between 2.5 and 5. Melanie Klein early on moved this back into the first year of life. The awareness of the existence of the third she saw as certainly beginning to appear by the second half of the first year of life. So it emerges quite early. There's been an interesting shift in psychoanalytic thought over the past 5 decades. Up until around 1950, the theory of the Oedipus complex was quite central in Freudian thinking. But in the decades since, there's been an increasing critique of Freudian thought for its neglect of what came to be known as the pre-Oedipal period, the period of the mother-infant dyad, and a lot of attention was removed from the Oedipal story onto the pre-Oedipal story, the origins of the sense of self and the origins of human relatedness being emphasized, the importance of the mother-infant connection, the quality of the holding, the quality of the containing by the mother, the quality of maternal care. All of this needed to be studied, and it needed to be brought into the psychoanalytic narrative for sure. But in the process of filling psychoanalytic theory out by bringing mother in a way that Freud had not, the idea somehow came to be that this was a pre-Oedipal period and that the Oedipus doesn't really become an issue until much later. I think this is clearly false. There is really no pre-Oedipal period. For Melanie Klein, there is pre-genital, but there is not really pre-Oedipal, and I think Klein was quite right about that. The triangular conflict is important very early on. And, you know, it even came to be thought that really only fairly well-integrated neurotics suffer from an Oedipus complex. People who have self-disorders or other relational kinds of problems are pre-Oedipal patients. It's not about the Oedipus complex. This is very misleading. This leads to huge oversight in the work with these patients. Everybody has an Oedipus complex. Everybody has to deal with the jealousy and the rivalry and the aggression and the envy and the guilt that come from finding that one is not the exclusive object of the desired object's love and attention and concern. Okay, these 3 elements, I think, are central to psychoanalytic theory. The fact that we are contradictory beings, the fact that therefore we need defense and disguise in terms of trying to cope with our contradictoriness, and thirdly, that we all have to deal with this trauma of discovering that we are not the center of mother's desire or the primary caregiver's desire, the decentering that comes from that.